a bad place to be in.
The video you just saw was an amalgamation of news footage taken the night of August 28, 1968, in the city of Chicago. With Lyndon Johnson announcing he would not seek re-election as president, a politically dominant Democratic Party met in Chicago to elect their new presidential candidate for that coming November. Students, unionists, civil rights leaders, peace activists, and, yes, communists, went to Chicago to protest the Democratic Party's continued support of the Vietnam War. They were met with resounding police violence, which was broadcast nationwide. Depending on who you were to ask from the time, the actions you just saw have been described as a police riot, radicals getting what was coming to them, or even a sign that surely the nation was coming apart. Regardless of how you characterize the riot, though, in some ways it was. Most historians now agree that what transpired that summer night on the streets of Chicago and in the elections that followed can also be described as the beginning of the end of something called the New Deal Coalition. So what was the coalition? How did it dominate American politics for so long, and what brought about its end? That's what we're going to be talking about today, but the rise and fall of the New Deal Coalition is incredibly complicated, and so it's worth spending some time on reviewing what we've already talked about since beginning our class. But first, let's take a look at our quote. Discrimination and segregation have long permeated much of American life. They now threaten the future of every American. This deepening racial division is not inevitable. The movement apart can be reversed. Choice is still possible. The Kerner Commission report was requested by Lyndon Johnson after a series of inner-city rebellions in the late 1960s that dominated American airwaves. Among one of the most noteworthy was the uprising that took place in Detroit in July 1967. In the report, instead of assigning criminality or blame to rioters, the report placed considerable emphasis on continued housing and employment discrimination facing marginalized communities of color. The report warned that unless steps were taken to immediately address these issues, the situation would only get worse. So let's look at the outline for today's lecture. We're going to start by talking about the long hot summer. What was it and what came about because of it? We're going to take a look at not only Black Power movements, specifically groups like the Black Panther Party, but also the New Left and forces like the Counterculture. We'll get into the breakdown of the New Deal coalition, and then we'll pivot it toward the end of our lecture to talk about Nixon's presidency after 1968, the policy of Vietnamization, and how Vietnam's end and legacy continue to impact American society today. Right, it's again worth recalling some of the more major primary points from our previous lectures, right? While progress had been made since the beginning of the early civil rights movement, some members of civil rights organizations argued that the movement's victories were too hard fought and too easily undone by opponents of civil rights who held positions of economic and political power. After a lifetime devoted to nonviolent civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Tennessee while working with striking sanitation workers. Martin Luther King had spoken out against the Vietnam War before his assassination, and during this time, a dedicated anti-war movement began to grow across the United States. As the Vietnam War dragged on in Southeast Asia, many Americans started to question America's involvement there. In 1968, the coordinated Tet Offensive, while proving to be a strategic disaster for the Viet Cong, led many Americans in the United States to believe the Vietnam War had become unwinnable. And throughout the Vietnam War, social movements back home continued to address issues of social, political, and economic inequality along lines of race, gender, class, and sexuality. These new social movements upset Americans who were wary of criticism directed at the United States, as well as pro-segregation Democrats who were especially strong in the American South. So let's talk about the long hot summer. Well, the civil rights reforms attempted to solve many issues faced by African Americans and other racial minorities, especially in the South. Racism remained practically unaddressed elsewhere in the country. And one issue that remained unresolved nationwide was the status of housing and housing discrimination. With many African American families largely excluded from home buying opportunities in the suburbs, African American families often found themselves stuck in cities, which, because of white flight and capital flight out of major cities, these cities were able to provide fewer and fewer amenities and resources to the residents who remained. A lot of these cities, which were often still dominated by majority white governments, were slow to react to problems facing inner city neighborhoods, and even to neglect inner city neighborhoods entirely. They instead prioritized business interests in the hopes of drawing investment back into the city, while not necessarily worrying too much about the status of marginalized families. The seeming obliviousness that city governments had toward African American communities led to substantial animosity between neighborhoods of color and the city government. These problems were often exacerbated by an overzealous police force, who were usually trained to use force in order to maintain public order instead of de-escalating tense situations. Beginning in 1967, tensions in major cities around the United States spilled over, leading to an upsurge of rioting and looting. This period of intense civil unrest in the United States is commonly referred to as the long, hot summer of 1967. Major cities affected by civil unrest include Birmingham, Alabama, Chicago, Illinois, New York City, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis, but particularly destructive incidents took place in Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan. I'm going to show you a brief video by the History Channel about the Detroit Uprising in 1967.
The Detroit Riots. In 1967, a riot broke out during a long, hot summer night in the Virginia Park neighborhood of Detroit, Michigan. Lasting more than 2 days, it was one of the most destructive riots in American history. We're going to take a look at what set the riots off, the riots themselves, and the consequences. In the late 1960s, the civil rights movement in the United States was growing stronger, but racial inequality was still a big problem. Deindustrialization of the cities and the desegregation of schools was causing a reshuffling of neighborhoods. As part of integration efforts, people of color moved into urban areas that were once predominantly white. But in response, many white people fled to the suburbs, some scared of integration, and some having lost their factory jobs. This phenomenon is called white flight and contributed to segregation. With many whites having fled urban centers, business owners and politicians neglected these new, mostly black neighborhoods, leading to overcrowding and deterioration. While Detroit spent money on developing and racially integrating the inner city, black residents of neighborhoods like Virginia Park were still dealing with housing and employment discrimination, poor access to medical services, an underfunded public education system, and racism from law enforcement. On July 23, 1967, at 3:15 a.m., the Vice Squad of the Detroit Police Department conducted a raid on an unlicensed bar on 12th Street in Virginia Park. Although it was late, the street was full of people trying to keep cool because of a heat wave. While the police were making arrests, a brick flew through a police car window, prompting the riots, looting, and fires that would rage for days. On July 25th, Governor George Romney called in the Michigan National Guard, and the riots finally ended on July 27th. But the damage and human loss was unprecedented. 43 people died. Over 1,000 were injured. Over 7,200 were arrested. More than 2,000 buildings and structures were damaged, and hundreds of families were left homeless. The riots accelerated the exodus of white people from the city, making segregation even worse. But it also drew attention to the problem. President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed a commission to figure out why the riots happened. The report found that white racism, discrimination, and poverty were to blame for the riots. It warned, quote, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal." 2 years later, the Stonewall Riots would occur at the Stonewall Inn in New York City, which was targeted in a raid very similar to the bar on 12th Street. Like in Detroit, the spontaneous violence at the Stonewall Inn also resulted from discrimination, but this time against the LGBT community. The Stonewall was a popular safe haven for New York's gay community. Detroit and Stonewall would be the most destructive riots in U.S. history until the 1992 Los Angeles riots, which reflected similar issues of inner-city racial segregation and discrimination. The Detroit riots remind us that even a century after the Civil War ended, the violent legacy of racism and discrimination was still present in American culture, a legacy that echoes through modern society, where protesters and activists still fight for racial equality across the country.
So like the video says, Lyndon Johnson's administration responded to the riots by assembling this Kerner Commission. The commission was tasked with explaining why the riots happened. In their report, the commission pointed towards continuing structural racism and discrimination, as well as poverty. In response to the Kerner Commission's suggestions, the Johnson administration drafted and passed the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, which both established the Department of Housing and Urban Development and provided greater funds for public housing, as well as housing specifically designed for lower-income families. While well-intentioned, the laws passed by the Johnson administration proved to be too expensive for critics of the program. Johnson's successor, Richard Nixon, ultimately halted all funds to the program when the country entered a recession in 1973, making the goals of the original program basically impossible to achieve. Now, while police violence had triggered civil unrest and rioting in cities like Newark and Detroit, in Oakland, California, perceived excesses carried out by the Oakland Police Department prompted civil rights activists to take other actions. In 1966, militant activists Bobby Seale and Huey Newton joined forces to form their own political organization, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, or known more simply as the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party's initial goals were essentially to arm African American citizens in Oakland. teach them how to handle guns safely, and educate them on their constitutional rights to decrease and eventually do away with police discrimination and violence perpetrated against them and their communities. The Black Panther Party began making armed patrols of Oakland's neighborhoods, and in response, California state government passed the Mulford Act. The Mulford Act prohibited openly carrying firearms in public and was essentially a veiled attempt to disarm the Black Panther Party. In an infamous protest, members of the Black Panther Party marched to the state capital of California to protest the bill. While the BPP was unable to keep the Mulford Act from passing, their protests saw widespread media coverage, and thus this exposure led many to seek membership in the BPP, or start their own chapters if one didn't already exist in the city they lived in. The Black Panther Party eventually refined its ideology and would argue that lasting, meaningful change would only occur in the United States through revolution. This put the Black Panther Party and other organizations like it at odds with the earlier civil rights movement organizations, which continued to advocate for change through nonviolent protest and legal reforms. As membership in the Black Panther Party grew, the party was able to provide lower-income urban communities with limited social programs that the government had been unwilling to meet. Perhaps the most well-known initiative that the Black Panthers launched was their Free Breakfast for School Children program. The Free Breakfast program elevated the party's popularity among white and Black urban poor and is sometimes credited with inspiring the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program for women, infants, and children, also known as SNAP-WIC. If you ever go to the grocery store and you see a sticker on certain food items that said SNAP-WIC accepted, that program was inspired by the Black Panther Party. The party also developed a rudimentary network of community health centers and its own ambulance services in some cities, in part to address the need for better access to health care in inner city neighborhoods. In Chicago, Black Panther Party Fred Hampton became known for encouraging inner city youth to drop out of gangs and begin volunteering in their communities. He also urged for an interracial organization that would include the Panthers and work towards a revolution that he called the Rainbow Coalition. While the Black Panther Party enjoyed a meteoric rise, its rapid growth also posed distinct challenges to party leaders. The party became known for the firefights they occasionally had with the police, caused in part by the fact that some of their members were poorly trained and could occasionally be reckless. Huey Newton allegedly killed a police officer, John Frey, in 1967 and was imprisoned for several years before being released in 1970. And Eldridge Cleaver is also alleged to have led an ambush in 1968 against Oakland police officers. During this conflict, 2 officers were wounded and one 17-year-old Panther, Bobby Hutton, was killed. The rapid growth of the party and its perceived turn towards violence and militancy led J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, to describe the party as, quote, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. In response to the growing popularity of the Black Panther Party, Hoover and others in the FBI targeted the party through COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Program, and it was basically a program that used extrajudicial methods to undermine organizations that the FBI deemed a considerable threat to American life and values. Examples go beyond the Black Panther Party and include feminist organizations, the Communist Party, anti-Vietnam War organizers, and activists and other organizations involved in the civil rights movement. Using infiltration, perjury, police harassment, and other tactics, COINTELPRO operatives were able to undermine Panther leadership, incriminate and assassinate party members, and both discredit and criminalize party activities. One of the most contentious moments in the FBI's war against the Black Panther Party was the assassination and murder of Fred Hampton by Chicago police in 1969. Chicago police broke into Hampton's home in the early hours of the morning without a warrant and shot him multiple times while he slept in bed. The killing has since become the subject of numerous books and documentaries. Over time, the Black Panther Party began to decline in influence and prestige. Huey Newton, the group's founder, eventually became addicted to drugs before he was murdered by members of the rival Black Guerrilla family in the 1980s. With many members of the Panthers in prison or exiled to countries like Algeria or Cuba or having been murdered, the BPP became largely defunct by 1982. Earlier civil rights leaders had feared that a Black Power approach to the civil rights movement may push away white allies, and they were partially proved correct as the 1960s wore on. As the civil rights movement began to transform into the Black Power movement, many progressive and leftist whites began to focus more on the Vietnam War than they had earlier on issues of racial inequality. Founded in 1960, but gaining significant members around 1965, many college campuses saw formations of chapters of the political group Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. Initially, SDS was involved with the free speech movement on college campuses and protested university policies that barred political groups from campus. As membership grew, though, the SDS moved to protest the Vietnam War more than they had before. The SDS would eventually grow into a massive organization and would be subject to the same COINTELPRO efforts that saw the demise of the BPP. Students for a Democratic Society itself would go through a series of organizational splits that led to the creation of smaller groups, some of which became far more militant and radical. Many SDS groups follow graduating college students off college campuses and into the workplace and workplace unions, leading to a resurgence in activism in the labor movement. This process often split labor unions as giant organizations like the United Auto Workers or the International Brotherhood of Teamsters fought over whether they should continue to support the Vietnam War or not. More militant SDS faction groups eventually coalesced into what became known as the Weather Underground Organization, more colloquially known just as the Weathermen. In contrast to the more moderate SDS groups, which argued for legal or a reformist approach to challenging the government in the Vietnam War, the Weathermen argued for violent revolution. The Weather Underground embarked on a series of bombings that targeted government officials and military personnel. In 1971, the Weathermen bombed the U.S. Capitol building, and in 1972, they bombed the Pentagon. There were no casualties as a result of these attacks, though both buildings sustained structural damage, and the Pentagon magnetic tapes holding top-secret information were destroyed. In 1971, a group called the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into an FBI field office and stole hundreds of documents relating to the FBI's COINTELPRO program. In 1972, these documents were leaked to the public, and as a result, the government restricted J. Edgar Hoover's COINTEL operations. Because of the illegal methods that the FBI used in its attack on radical organizations, the government was forced to reverse charges against groups like the Weather Underground and the Black Panther Party, though many of its activists remained in self-imposed exile, and these reversals didn't undo the assassinations that had killed folks like Fred Hampton. While groups like SDS would argue for reforming the government, and the Weather Underground called for armed revolution, a much larger counterculture challenged rules and social norms in America through other means. Colloquially referred to as hippies in the 1960s, this counterculture movement actually dates to before the 1950s, when poets, artists, and musicians sought to critique capitalism, specifically American consumerism, through performance and limited demonstrative activism. Members of the counterculture were widely referred to as beatniks in the 1950s, but terms gradually evolved so that beatniks became referred to as hipsters, and that term was eventually shortened to hippies. Hippies were well known for their largely anti-materialist stance in relation to mainstream society, at least stereotypically, as well as for their open tolerance towards normally taboo practices and distinct concern for the environment. People involved in the 1960s counterculture were less critical of drugs and sexuality, and at times openly supported the use of psychedelic drugs to explore alternative states of consciousness. The counterculture facilitated the spread and increased use of lesser-known drugs in the 1960s like LSD or acid, and psilocybin, the chemical that is in magic mushrooms. This prompted the government to criminalize these substances. One prominent advocate of the counterculture was psychologist Timothy Leary, who encouraged the nation's use to, quote, question authority, and turn on, tune in, and drop out. These calls did not go unheeded. As a larger community, many involved in the counterculture placed less emphasis on jobs and employment or education, instead arguing that personal happiness and fulfillment should be the central aspect defining what one does in life. This put the counterculture at odds with the existing Red Scare mentality held in the United States, and led to substantial friction between hippies and the rest of mainstream society. While members of the wider counterculture were, on average, less militant than members of organizations like the Black Panther Party or the Weather Underground, they did engage in political movements, and these movements included feminist and environmentalist concerns, among others. In their efforts to embrace alternative music, art, and ways of living, however, the counterculture served as a starting point for innovations in music and art that would spread throughout American society. Artists like the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, and others all traced their starting point to the counterculture scene. In 1969, organizers put on a free 4-day music festival in New York that came to be known as the Woodstock Music Festival, or just Woodstock. The event was widely attended, with estimates putting actual participants at well above 400,000 viewers. The festival has become widely regarded as a pivotal moment in popular music history and a defining event for the counterculture. Attempts to recreate the Woodstock Festival in California later that year led to 3 deaths at the Altamont Free Concert, however, and later iterations of Woodstock have descended into violence, most notably at Woodstock 99. So we've seen how the slow pace of civil rights reform led many to question the efficacy of the Democratic Party and the advocating of civil rights reform through legal means, right? This policy of gradual change. At the same time, Lyndon Johnson was a Democratic president, and anti-war activists and students grew increasingly upset with his support for the Vietnam War as the 1960s dragged on. What does all this have to do with the New Deal coalition, and what was it? Well, beginning in 1932 with the election of FDR, but also following the end of World War II as time went on, different interest groups, community voting blocs, labor leaders, and even progressive business executives came together as part of a wider national consensus that supported FDR's New Deal reforms and sought to expand them amid the post-war economic boom with the hopes of avoiding another depression in the future. This collection of supporters of the New Deal came to be known as the New Deal Coalition. It's also sometimes referred to as the Labor Liberal Coalition. So if you see that term, it's more or less kind of the same idea. The New Deal Coalition was this amalgamation of supporters, and they all voted for largely Democratic presidential candidates from 1932 until the late 1960s. The New Deal Coalition made the Democratic Party the major party during that period, and with the exception of Dwight Eisenhower, who was a pro-New Deal Republican, every president from 1932 until 1968 was a Democrat. Well, the New Deal Coalition was able to pass a variety of forms throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The coalition began to unravel as time went on. This decline has been attributed to a variety of intersecting factors, and no single reason serves as an adequate explanation for the loss of the coalition's political power. Here are some reasons often provided for the decline of the coalition's popularity, though, right? The Democratic Party supported the Vietnam War, while student activists and demonstrators did not. Interpretations of causes of the long hot summer drove a wedge between different factions within the larger coalition. Southern segregationists drew away from the coalition as pressure built to address these racial inequalities. Different opinions of the growing counterculture and other social movements and how the state should respond to them opened similar divisions within the coalition. At the same time, activists associated with these movements began abandoning the Democratic Party in favor of building their own political alternatives that would be more receptive and reactive to their specific concerns. Perhaps the largest reason that is often cited for the decline of the coalition is the Democratic Party's support for the civil rights movement. While Lyndon Johnson's signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 signaled monumental victories for civil rights activists in the feminist movement, many more conservative voters in the southern and western states were not so pleased with the reforms, which they felt was flying in the face of their own regional traditions and was inviting undue political stress on the nation. These regional traditions, of course, were traditions of segregation, right? The Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were not the only reforms that many Southern voters were dismayed by. As you may recall, gains in the civil rights movement extend back before the end of World War II. FDR signed Executive Order 8802, desegregating the defense industry, and Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces. For the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, there are examples of fissures within the coalition that we can point to when investigating the collapse of the New Deal coalition. When FDR worked on building the coalition, for example, he commonly deferred to white Southern voters who largely voted Democratic. In 1948, however, the Democratic National Convention, many in the party agreed that Democrats had needed to abandon their support for states' rights in favor of human rights. Democrats from Southern states were outraged and walked out of the convention. In response to what they interpreted as an attack on Southern cultural traditions, segregation, dissenting Southern Democrats formed the Dixiecrats, or States' Rights Democratic Party, and nominated Strom Thurmond for president to run against the original Democrats, as well as the Republicans. While the Dixiecrats as a party did not last long after the 1948 elections, their movement to unseat the progressive wing of the New Deal coalition and its advocacy for civil rights will come into play in later elections. In 1964, running against Lyndon Johnson, Barry Goldwater attempted to court many disgruntled white Democrats in the southern states by campaigning on a platform of states' rights that was justified not in terms of racial segregation, but came from a perspective of libertarianism, smaller government, and the prevention of federal overreach. Goldwater's campaign, like Strom Thurmond's, also ended in defeat. He was only able to carry states in the Deep South as well as his home state of Arizona. Goldwater's strategy proved to have monumental importance for the election in 1968, however, just 4 years later, because Richard Nixon incorporated Goldwater's methods into his own attempt to woo Southern voters in what became known as Nixon's Southern strategy. Before the general election of 1968, even more turmoil took place. Several upsets in national politics seemed to throw the electoral process into turmoil. In March of 1968, Lyndon Johnson shocked much of the country when he announced that he would withdraw from the presidential race and would not seek a second term as president. Johnson had become widely unpopular from the continued American involvement in the Vietnam War, and in the January Tet Offensive, many Americans had become convinced that the war was unwinnable, and this only hurt Johnson's credibility further. With Johnson out of the race, most Democrats considered Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of JFK, to be the likely Democratic nominee. Despite his popularity, however, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in June of 1968 by a Palestinian named Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan Sirhan was upset with Kennedy's support for Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory after the 1967 Six-Day War. Now, we haven't had an opportunity to talk about the Middle East too much in our class thus far. We will return to the Six-Day War and American support for Israel in the second half of the semester. But lastly, in 1967, George Wallace formed the American Independent Party, attempting to scale back the gains won by the Civil Rights Movement by arguing for a return to states' rights and a reduced federal oversight of the elections process and other laws that had been overturned by the Civil Rights Act. This left the prospective Democratic field bereft of major political leaders and with much less support than they had just 4 years earlier. Hubert Humphrey and Eugene McCarthy remained the two main candidates running for Democratic nomination. Eugene McCarthy, who opposed the Vietnam War, was popular amongst many students and anti-war activists. Humphrey was favored by others remaining in the New Deal coalition. Tension within the party came to a head at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. As you saw in the video, anti-war protesters, civil rights activists, feminist activists all arrived in Chicago to protest the convention, realizing that Humphrey was going to be the likely nominee. Groups like SDS, the Youth International Party, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, or the MOB, arrived in Chicago with over 10,000 protesters, but they were greeted by well over 26,000 Chicago policemen. These policemen and protesters attacked one another in what is referred to sometimes as a police riot. Violence ensued, and many Americans watching the proceedings from home were shocked and dismayed by the events in Chicago. With the Democratic Party torn apart by infighting, Wallace's American Independent Party taking away many of the Southern votes in the New Deal coalition that were relied on to maintain political power, and with Nixon's own law and order campaign and Southern strategy sweeping up the rest, Hubert Humphrey showed little promise of winning the 1968 election. He further alienated the youth vote by continuing to support the Vietnam War. Humphrey ultimately lost the 1968 presidential election, and Richard Nixon came to power. The 1968 presidential election is important for several reasons. First, it was widely regarded as the end of the New Deal coalition, as well as the beginning of the end of America's post-war economic boom that had started back in 1945. It was seen as a major upset, as many had believed that Nixon only had a very thin chance at ever becoming president at the start of the year. It was unlikely at best. And the events of 1968 to many just showcased the inability of liberal politics to solve national problems. Okay, so the New Deal coalition is ostensibly over in 1968. It's going to hobble along for another 4 years or so, in all honesty, before it's really dead. But what happens after 1968? Well, let's look at Nixon's presidency, and specifically we'll look at Vietnamization. Well, Richard Nixon was not an opponent of the Vietnam War. He did want it to end on terms that were good for the United States. This would be achieved, Nixon argued, by training the South Vietnamese army to stand up for itself without American assistance, a process that he named Vietnamization. The United States began supplying South Vietnam with more weapons, while at the same time withdrawing troops stationed in South Vietnam. The US continued to use its Air Force to bomb targets in North Vietnam as well as South Vietnam to help the South Vietnamese government fight against the Viet Cong. Although the anti-war movement had been growing, Nixon insisted that he had the approval of the silent majority, or large swaths of the American public who supported American involvement in Vietnam, but simply did not voice those views in public. They weren't visible because they weren't attending large protests. Richard Nixon also sought to intimidate other nations in the communist bloc to reducing their assistance to North Vietnam through a strategy he called the madman theory. Richard Nixon argued that if he and his administration could make the leaders of the Soviet Union, China, and other communist nations think that Nixon was irrational and volatile, they would challenge the United States less, fearing that a nuclear war was more likely. This is kind of an example of brinksmanship. At the same time, though, Nixon also attempted to pursue détente with nations like China to break apart the communist alliances. Détente is this fourth and the final method that we're going to talk about in this class, where the US employs these different strategies in confronting communist expansion. Advocates of détente argued that by easing tensions between two nations through diplomacy and gestures of mutual goodwill, they can avoid the possibility of war. By adopting both stances of brinksmanship and détente in his foreign policy, Nixon could make sure foreign leaders saw him as unpredictable and dangerous vis-a-vis his madman strategy. This, he hoped, would help prevent communist acts of aggression or communist expansion. While the war dragged on in Vietnam, several scandals led to international condemnation of the United States, as well as still greater unrest on college campuses and in American cities. In March of 1968, in what would become known as the Mili massacre, soldiers in an army unit led by Colonel William Calley attacked and murdered over 504 civilians in the Vietnamese villages of Mili and My Cay. The army unit had been attacked by the Viet Cong after moving through the area and, believing the villagers had sent the Viet Cong after them, returned to the area to exact revenge. The massacre was only stopped after a helicopter crew intervened to defend the remaining villagers. This was also another American detachment. In addition to the murderers and the following military investigation, widespread sexual assault and torture of the villagers was uncovered during the massacre. The army successfully covered up the My Lai massacre, awarding the participants combat medals until the story was broken by Seymour Hersh, an investigative journalist, in 1969. The international outrage prompted the military to rescind the medals and court-martialed those involved in the massacre. However, all were acquitted of charges except for Calley, who was placed under house arrest from 1971 until his early release in 1974. The My Lai massacre did little to help boost American prestige internationally. Richard Nixon's escalation of the war into neighboring Cambodia would further agitate the anti-war movement and other international critics of the United States. In April of 1970, Nixon ordered that troops secretly invade the country of Cambodia, which had been neutral in the Vietnam War and fighting its own civil war with the communist Khmer Rouge up until that point. The goals of Nixon's invasion of Cambodia were to capture leaders of the Viet Cong and shut down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While the invasion did result in the US capturing a lot of Viet Cong supplies, no leaders were captured, and the US was forced to withdraw. The communist Khmer Rouge in Cambodia took credit for forcing this withdrawal, leading to a meteoric rise in their own popularity. Back in the United States, when the invasion of Cambodia became public knowledge, college campuses exploded in protest. At Kent State, in an altercation with the Ohio National Guard, 4 students were shot and killed, forcing many college campuses to close early for the academic year. So let's talk about Vietnam's end in legacy. In 1972, the North Vietnamese Army attempted to overrun the South in the Easter Offensive. While the U.S. troops were withdrawing from the country, U.S. air power assisted the South Vietnamese government in repulsing the invasion that was also coordinated from several different fronts. It's kind of like a second Tet Offensive. While worrying advocates who still argued that a U.S. troop presence in Vietnam was necessary to keep the North from overrunning the country, the war had become so unpopular, Nixon and others still stuck to their exit strategy. Maybe Vietnamization isn't working. It doesn't matter. We can't keep this up. In 1972, the US, Viet Cong, and North and South Vietnam met in France to hammer out a ceasefire agreement in what Richard Nixon would come to call, quote, peace with honor. While representatives from the South Vietnamese government opposed the agreement, the US threatened to withdraw from the war unilaterally if they did not sign it. Taking effect in 1973, the United States began removing more troops out of Vietnam. Despite the Paris Peace Accords coming into effect in February of 1973, the Viet Cong, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam continued fighting one another. By mid-1973, all parties had agreed that the Paris Peace Accords had failed and hostilities resumed. The US, which was economically suffering from an oil embargo and growing interventions into the president following the Watergate scandal, was reluctant to intervene. Despite calls from South Vietnam to intercede, the US Congress, controlled by Democratic opponents of the Nixon administration, refused to appropriate funds to South Vietnam. So gradually, the Viet Cong and the NVA, or North Vietnamese Army, drew closer to the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon. By 1975, Richard Nixon had resigned as president, leaving his sort of vice president, Gerald Ford, in charge of the country. We'll come back to this after our midterm when we return from spring break. In April of 1975, though, the Viet Cong had surrounded the capital of Saigon and had begun shelling the airport there. It was at this point that President Ford gave the order to evacuate all American personnel from the city. The American staff had to historically leave the embassy by helicopter because the airport had been so badly damaged that it couldn't land and service larger conventional aircraft like jet planes or even passenger propeller planes. During this evacuation, the U.S. Embassy staff also spirited away hundreds of Vietnamese families by helicopter until the Viet Cong eventually broke through Saigon's defenses on April 30th, 1975. Vietnam was ultimately reunified under the Northern Hanoi government a year later in 1976, and the city of Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam as a conflict was incredibly costly. Through the course of the war, over 58,000 Americans lost their lives, and another 300,000 were wounded in action, at least half of whom, over 150,000, required extensive stays in military and civilian hospitals. One of these individuals, of course you'll know, was Ron Kovic. Estimates place Vietnamese casualties above 1.5 million lives lost. Most of these were civilians. Vietnam has a contested legacy. Even today, as historians, veterans, politicians, and everyday people struggle to grapple with the lessons from the war. Historian William Appleman Williams described the dismay at the experience of having American supremacy defeated overseas as a kind of empire shock. For many Americans, Vietnam represented the only war that America had ever lost. Over time, two main schools of thought on how the Vietnam War should be remembered emerged. Hawks believed that The United States lost Vietnam because the judgment of the military was overruled by civilian leaders and public opinion, which was turned negative by the press. Vietnam, Hawks assert, could have been won if the troops were not undermined by the interference of politicians and the emergence of such a massive anti-war movement back home. The Mili massacre, if you were to ask a Hawk, is something that just happens in war. Hawks argue that Vietnam taught us that the military should be allowed to do what it thinks it's necessary without question to win wars, and feared the potential of a Vietnam syndrome. Vietnam syndrome is the term applied to what politicians saw as the reluctance on the part of Americans to become involved in future foreign wars because of the country's negative experience with the Vietnam War. Vietnam syndrome would arguably go on to shape American foreign policy for the rest of the Cold War, and really wouldn't see retraction until 1991. Doves argued that the United States should not have become involved in Vietnam in the first place, and the attitudes of the Cold War in the emergence of a more powerful executive office, or the presidency, kept Americans from seeing where U.S. interests should have lay. Doves argued that the Vietnamese struggle from 1945 to 1975 was less about expanding communism and had more to do with nationalist desires for independence and unification. Doves assert that the president should not have been able to drag America into wars without the public's approval. This sentiment was somewhat adopted by the government when it passed the War Powers Act of 1973. This limited how long a president could commit American troops to a conflict without the approval of Congress. In Southeast Asia, the victory of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong over the South Vietnamese government led to the success of other communist movements in the surrounding area. In 1975, the Pathet Lao and the Khmer Rouge overthrew the governments of Laos and Cambodia, installing their own repressive governments in these countries. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge embarked on a massive ethnic cleansing campaign shortly after taking power. Headed by Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge would ultimately massacre over a third of Cambodia's population through forced labor, targeted starvation, and systematic torture. Pol Pot was only removed from power by a Vietnamese invasion in the Third Indo-Chinese War of 1979. Some Dove historians have argued that the US presence in Southeast Asia, without that presence being there, the Khmer Rouge never would have gotten powerful or popular enough to overthrow the Cambodian government. Right? By virtue of the US being in Vietnam, people in neighboring countries were radicalized, and thus communism expanded. He made the situation worse. Hawks, of course, would tell you that the coming to power of Khmer Rouge or the Pathet Lao in Laos is verification that the domino theory, the idea that we had to stop the communists in South Vietnam, was true. So there's still disagreement there, right? So where does that leave us? In 1932, the Democratic Party emerged as the preeminent political power by turning itself into a big tent party. A big tent party is where a political party tries to include as many voting blocs as possible in its coalition by advocating for popular programs and by resisting addressing controversial issues whenever possible. When reform is needed, big tents work slowly, oftentimes with the knowledge that too rapid of movement can fracture a coalition. By 1968, with the Great Depression and increasingly distant memory, the more prescient issues of racial justice, warfare, and social equality put greater stress on the coalition. States' rights and segregationists left to support other candidates because the party's nominal support for civil rights, while at the same time, the gradual pace of change alienated civil rights activists who felt their concerns were not being addressed in a timely and reasonable manner. The party's maintained stance in support of Vietnam drove the student and anti-war movements out of the party, and after the party's position changed in 1968 in favor of an end to the Vietnam War, pro-war Democrats similarly left the party. By this point, however, the peace and student movements had been left out of the coalition years ago, and they demonstrated no serious desire to return. All of this was further contextualized by the weakening of the American labor movement. Nearly 15 years after the passage of Taft-Hartley, back in 1947, so actually more than 20 years, one of the New Deal coalition's strongest blocs, right? The American labor movement, one of the New Deal coalition's strongest blocs, it's been severely weakened, and it lacks the political resources that it had enjoyed back in 1945. it might go without saying that the political future of our country today is uncertain, perhaps even now more than ever before. But Americans in 1968 faced similar circumstances too, and similar uncertainties. What comes after an end to a New Deal coalition? What comes after such a massive political realignment? A lot of times when we talk about the breakup of this New Deal coalition, this collapse of the Democratic Party is really essentially oftentimes the government of the United States. You do have these Republican periods where they kind of lose power for a time, but until 1968, they've always recovered it. When we talk about the collapse of the New Deal coalition, a lot of times people have to remember to take into account political capacity, right? This is sometimes a subset of what's known as state capacity. How much can a government or a country do without stretching its resources beyond the breaking point? That can also apply for political coalitions and parties, right? What can the Democratic Party do to keep this New Deal coalition running without exhausting all of its resources, without, essentially blowing through all of its supporters? By 1968, the Democratic Party has become so stagnant and it's become so unchanging and ossified, right? It can't fluctuate. It can't shift really a lot of ground without cracking or breaking. And so a lot of times people will look back on this New Deal coalition and say, well, the Democrats should have done this or done that or done that. And it fails to take into account the Democratic Party's political capacity. What could they have done without losing all of these members? If this is something that interests you, this is going to be one of our discussion board responses, right? If you're coming to this lecture after watching the science and technology lecture, you already know one of those is about balancing environmentalism with the demands of like the economy, the requirements to continue feeding and housing people. This one's a little different. For the discussion board response for this lecture, I'm really going to kind of ask you almost to make your own political party, right? You're in the Vietnam era, you have all of these pressing issues that you have to contend with: civil rights, the peace movement, non-proliferation, environmental concerns, the counterculture. How does a political party prioritize things? How does it tackle issues while not blowing through all of its political capacity and breaking apart like the Democratic Party really kind of does by the end of the 1960s? I ask you, really, if you're in the shoes of someone running the Democratic Party at the end of the 60s, how do you keep that from happening? And almost kind of to a lesser consideration, are we potentially seeing that happen today? Who's to say? All of that aside, though, by the end of the week, just again, if you are watching this lecture after the science and technology one, a lot of this is going to be repeat, but if you're not, and you're watching this one first, it's worth mentioning or reminding, make sure you do those 2 discussion board responses. There will be a total of 4. Respond to 2 of them, but also reply to some of your colleagues' responses, right? If they make a point that you aren't following along with, maybe you can offer your insights, say, I don't really think I understand what you mean by this, but here's what I took away with it. Or maybe they're making a case that you don't exactly agree with, or maybe you do agree with it, but they're coming at it from the wrong, or not the wrong necessarily, right? But a different perspective that you can't really quite come to terms with. Don't be afraid to make some of these replies, of course, in good faith, but jump into that discussion. Really kind of ask everyone, each other, how do you see this issue? This is how I see it. Here's where we differ. Why do we differ in this way? These sorts of things. We have some readings, again, for the end of the week. We have chapters 3 and 4 of These United States, so make sure you're following up with that. We are done, or supposedly done. If you're not done with your autobiographies, please make sure you're finishing that. But we're supposed to be done with the autobiographies now. But we have like kind of lighter readings in addition to these chapters, just 2 articles. One is by the Detroit Metro Times about toxic waste and how it kind of disproportionately affects communities of color and non-predominantly white communities in the metropolitan Detroit area. This article is really true for Detroit, but you can see it kind of repeated in a lot of other places in the United States. We also have a short Washington Post article about the Southern strategy. So like obviously finishing up this lecture, you'll kind of have a better grasp of what the Southern strategy is. How do we understand it? How do we sometimes get things wrong about the Southern strategy? So follow along with that article, especially if you want to respond to the discussion board post for this lecture. And obviously keep in mind that by June 4th, you do need to have those historical autobiography book reports in and submitted into Canvas. If you have any questions with that, if you're having any kind of trouble in the writing process or kind of getting these drafts together, making sure you're getting them to me on time, don't be afraid to reach out and ask for any help. We can set aside, office hours like by appointment, like a Zoom thing, if that works for you, or if you'd rather just exchange messages over email or Canvas, that works for me too. But I am here to help if you're having difficulty with that. If you do need an extension, just make sure you're reaching out to me, before the night before. But I'm looking forward really to hearing what everyone has to say, what their thoughts about these two books are, how they kind of receive them, what their opinions are on them, what they thought was important. So I am definitely looking forward to those book reports, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone's insightful and constructive conversations on the discussion board.